J.D. Vance extended his hand for a handshake, but the Royal Guard didn't even flinch. The second most powerful man in America, completely ignored. But what was the reason? Before we reveal the reason, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The morning air over Whitehall hung thick with that signature London dampness. Not quite rain, not quite fog, but something in between that seeps into your bones and makes history feel heavier somehow. Light drizzle from earlier had left the stone around the cenotaph slick and darkened, as if the monument itself was weeping. Union Jacks hung limp against their poles, barely stirring in the whisper of a breeze. The kind of stillness usually reserved for churches and graveyards blanketed the square. And standing motionless among that stillness, like he'd grown right up from the stone beneath his boots, was Corporal Daniel Reev. Even from a distance, you could see the precision in every inch of him. The scarlet tunic of his Coldstream Guards uniform pressed so crisp it could probably cut paper. His bearskin hat towered a full foot above his head, the chin strap pulled tight enough to leave marks he'd feel hours later. Boots polished to mirrors, reflecting the pale London sky in perfect little ovals. His white-gloved hands cradled his rifle with practiced perfection. Not a finger out of place, not a tremor to be found. Just looking at him, you might think he was a statue, some artist's rendering of the perfect British soldier, planted there for tourists to photograph. But behind that marble stillness lived a mind trained for two worlds that never quite overlapped: infantry and ceremony, combat and pageantry, the dust of Helmand Province and the polished stones of Whitehall. Neither had ever asked for his opinion, only his discipline. And today, that discipline wasn't just about protocol, it was about remembrance. The motorcade appeared right on schedule, 7:30 a.m. sharp, gliding to a stop just beyond Horse Guards Road with that sleek, purring efficiency that screams diplomatic importance. Identical black cars with tinted windows. Small American flags fluttering from the hood. Security detail in identical dark suits, earpieces, and sunglasses, fanning out with practiced nonchalance, scanning rooftops and alleyways, even though every inch of the route had been secured hours ago. From the second vehicle, never the first, that's a security trick as old as motorcades themselves, stepped Vice President J.D. Vance. He moved with that particular kind of confidence unique to men who've risen fast and far, part swagger, part performance. Silver-grey suit tailored to perfection, that telltale red poppy pinned to his lapel, looking just a touch too new, like someone had handed it to him moments before he stepped out. Even under the heavy blanket of clouds, he didn't remove his sunglasses. Just adjusted his tie, glanced at his watch, and plastered on that camera-ready smile as British officials stepped forward to greet him. Vance wasn't entirely unfamiliar with military protocol. His own brief service as a Marine Corps public affairs officer had given him just enough exposure to uniform and ceremony to make him dangerous, that peculiar mix of partial knowledge and complete confidence that so often leads powerful men astray. Back home, uniformed personnel saluted him. They shook his hand when offered. They broke protocol for photo ops because that's how Washington works. The machinery of American politics runs on these moments of carefully choreographed accessibility. Voters like seeing power that bends, hands that reach, traditions that flex when needed. "Lord Chamberlain," Vance said, voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the nearest press photographer. "Honour to be here." The handshake was firm, quick, businesslike. He pivoted immediately toward the memorial, already moving before the introduction was properly finished. Cameras clicked in rapid-fire bursts behind the barricades. He checked his watch again, the second time in less than a minute. A man with places to be. And through it all, Corporal Reev didn't move, didn't blink. didn't shift his weight or clear his throat or scratch that itch blooming under his tight collar. He'd performed ceremonial duties for funerals, coronations, and visits from royalty and world leaders. He'd saluted heads of state and knelt beside strangers during emergencies without breaking form. This duty, this silent representation of something older than any single person's title, wasn't about performance. It was presence. He was there because the dead couldn't be. As the last attendees took their positions and the military band's final notes faded into morning air, a deep hush fell over the gathering. That rare, sacred kind of quiet that happens when hundreds of people collectively decide to honor something greater than themselves. The Vice President of the United States, now standing just 15 feet from Reev's fixed position, gave a subtle nod in the guard's direction, expecting perhaps some small acknowledgement of his presence. But the guard remained still, exactly as trained, exactly as required, exactly as he should have. You could see it in Vance's face, that flicker of confusion, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. He wasn't used to being ignored, not in Washington, not on the campaign trail, and certainly not on foreign soil by someone in uniform. His hand had half raised in an aborted greeting before dropping awkwardly back to his side. He cleared his throat, that universal sound people make when they're trying to pretend a fumble never happened. An aide leaned in close, lips barely moving. "They don't break form during ceremony, sir. Royal protocol." Vance didn't respond, but the corners of his mouth tightened into something not quite a smile. It wasn't anger exactly, more like bewilderment mixed with that particular American brand of entitlement that expects every door to open, every hand to extend. He hadn't grown up around ceremony like this. His instincts were to connect, to acknowledge, to establish that invisible bridge between people. To him, the guard's stillness felt like rejection, but to everyone else watching, it was devotion. The ceremony began with the precision of clockwork that had been ticking for centuries. The Lord Chamberlain stepped forward first, placing the wreath of poppies with a slow, practiced grace that spoke of years of similar motions. A full minute of silence descended, that special kind of quiet that feels different from ordinary silence, heavier, more deliberate. Heads bowed across the square. The band ceased. Even the usual background rhythm of London traffic seemed to fade away, as if the city itself was honouring the moment. That's when it happened. Corporal Reev raised his right arm into perfect salute. The motion was fluid, deliberate. No wasted effort, no hesitation. His hand held position with absolute precision, fingers aligned, elbow bent exactly as regulations demanded. His eyes remained locked forward, seeing everything and nothing at once. To tourists watching from beyond the barriers, it probably looked like just another part of the ceremony. To Reev, it was something sacred. And that was the exact moment Vice President Vance chose to step forward again. He broke away from the American delegation's perfect line, just 3 steps, unhurried but deliberate. Moving closer to Reev, while the guard's hand was still frozen in salute. "Appreciate your service, soldier," Vance said, voice low, but carrying in the dense silence. He extended his hand, a gesture meant to bridge nations, recover his earlier misstep, maybe even create a photo opportunity. But Reev didn't move, and his salute held steady. The line of his sight remained locked forward. Not a muscle in his face twitched, not at the proximity, not at the title, not at the extended hand waiting just inches from him. And still, Vance stood there, arm outstretched, palm open. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, 4, 5. 5 full seconds of silence. The kind that feels like drowning. The air between them practically vibrated with tension. British officials exchanged glances but didn't intervene. A few older military men in the crowd straightened their spines instinctively. One veteran near the back whispered to his grandson, "Watch this, lad. You're seeing something they don't teach in schools." The boy, no more than 10, nodded solemnly without understanding exactly why. Rain began to fall again, not the misty drizzle from earlier, but real droplets that tapped against the stone with increasing urgency. They splashed against Reev's bearskin, rolling down in perfect lines like tears the guard himself would never shed. They collected on Vance's extended hand, dripping from his fingers onto the hallowed ground between them. Even the weather seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see which man would break first. Finally, an aide touched Vance's elbow. Just the lightest pressure. "Sir, please, it's not personal." Vance withdrew his hand with painful slowness, lips pressed into a thin line. "Feels pretty damn personal," he muttered, just loud enough for those closest to hear. But Corporal Reev wasn't protesting. He wasn't snubbing. He wasn't making a statement. He was doing his job, exactly as he'd been trained to do. When the minute of silence concluded, the band resumed with subtle, mournful notes. Reev lowered his arm in perfect synchronization with the other guards stationed around the memorial, no faster, no slower, seamless, as if nothing unusual had happened. But everyone present knew something had. That moment, not the wreath-laying, not the speeches, not even the solemn music, became the thing that stayed with everyone who witnessed it. That extended hand. And the man who wouldn't break his salute to take it. The Vice President of the United States had offered a gesture meant to symbolize friendship, alliance, and yes, let's be honest, a perfect photo op for tomorrow's papers. But the man he'd offered it to, Corporal Daniel Reev of the Coldstream Guards, had simply kept saluting the dead. It wasn't rudeness. It wasn't politics. It wasn't even a choice. It was discipline in its purest form. Across centuries of service, the Guards' salute at the Cenotaph was reserved for one thing only: honouring the fallen. Not for applause, not for handshakes, certainly not for breaking protocol to accommodate a visiting politician, even one whose motorcade flew tiny presidential flags. "Does he not realise this is an act of remembrance?" one British official murmured, just loud enough for his colleague to hear. "He thinks it's a photo opportunity," came the whispered reply. From the American side, aides scrambled to manage the optics. The uncomfortable exchange had been caught by at least 3 cameras, an image of the Vice President with an unanswered handshake, while the British Guard remained rigid, eyes forward, as if carved from the same granite as the memorial itself. "Sir," an aide whispered with barely concealed urgency, "it's not done. They don't break formation during salutes, especially not here." Vance glanced toward the press line, then back at the guard, his jaw visibly tightening beneath his carefully neutral expression. He could have at least acknowledged me. A US Marine Corps colonel, attached to the delegation, a man who'd maintained professional silence until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of someone who understood both sides. "He did acknowledge you, sir. By not lowering his salute, he acknowledged what this place means and what it doesn't." That quiet correction landed harder than any headline ever could. Across the square, Reev's arm returned to his side as the ceremonial music transitioned. The procession continued, each step precisely measured, each movement deliberately solemn. But the guard had offered no apology, no adjustment, no sideways glance for approval or concern. He had followed the code, one every guardsman learns before they ever don the famous red coat. A code that puts duty before diplomacy, symbol before spectacle. Later, when the US delegation posed for official photos near the Cenotaph, Vance stood slightly off-centre, no longer commanding the frame as he typically did. He didn't mention the moment again. But those who'd witnessed it didn't need commentary. They'd seen something rare with their own eyes. A single refusal that spoke volumes about what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. A man who would not abandon tradition for a soundbite. And a uniform that did not flinch. Long before he wore the scarlet tunic and towering bearskin, Daniel Reev had been a soldier in sand, not ceremony. He enlisted at 17, gangly-limbed and wide-eyed, too young to legally buy a pint, but old enough to carry an SA-80 rifle through the dusty valleys of Helmand province. His first deployment came fast, his first loss even faster. They were ambushed just outside Sangin, a hidden IED that ripped through their convoy like it was made of paper, followed by gunfire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The world became dust and blood and screaming. His best mate from basic training, Harris, took shrapnel to the neck. He was gone before the dust settled. Reev pulled him from the wreckage anyway, hands slippery with blood and grit, refusing to leave him behind even when the order came to fall back. 2 days later, during the ramp ceremony at Camp Bastion, Reev stood in rigid formation as the casket was loaded. The Union Jack draped over Harris looked impossibly bright against the desert backdrop. As the Hercules transport roared to life, sand and dust whipping across the tarmac, Reev held his salute. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't let the tear that clung to his lashes fall, not until the plane disappeared into the empty Afghan sky. That was the first salute that truly mattered. And from that day forward, everyone had to mean something. After 2 tours and a brief recovery from a shrapnel injury that left a spider web of scars across his left shoulder, Reev was offered a place with the Coldstream Guards ceremonial detachment. Most people thought it was a cushy reassignment. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace, performing for tourists, getting your photo taken by visitors trying to make you crack a smile. But Reev saw it differently. It wasn't about the uniform or the performance. It was about protecting something older than himself, older than the wars, older than the politicians who came and went with the seasons. Ceremonial didn't mean fake. It meant sacred. His years on the front lines never left him. Not really. He remembered too clearly how fast death moved, how suddenly silence fell. He remembered the weight of real duty, not the performance of it, but the truth of it, the razor-thin line between order and chaos that men like him were trained to walk. At the Cenotaph, that line was carved in stone. So when the Vice President stepped forward during the salute, Reev didn't see politics or diplomacy or international relations. He saw a moment meant to honour the dead being turned into something else. He saw a break in the silence that should have held. He saw Harris, 18 years old and gone in seconds, being used as a backdrop. And so he didn't move. Not out of defiance, not out of rudeness, not out of politics, but because he had learned, in the dust and blood of a foreign war, that some silences are sacred. And to break this one would be betrayal of the highest order. Behind the black iron railings of Whitehall, once the formal ceremony concluded and the band softened into a gentle recessional, the quiet machinery of diplomacy resumed its motion. The US delegation was escorted toward the Royal Banqueting House for a private briefing and tea reception. Most cameras remained focused on the Cenotaph itself. The awkward handshake moment had been subtle, missed by many of the press, but not by those who mattered. In a side corridor, away from microphones and lenses, a conversation unfolded in hushed tones. "He didn't acknowledge the Vice President," one American staffer said, voice sharp with confusion and a touch of indignation. "No," replied Lieutenant Colonel Stewart, the British military attaché assigned to the delegation, "because it would have violated both protocol and his personal duty." The staffer looked unconvinced. "It was just a handshake." Stewart paused, choosing his words carefully. "And that salute was for the dead. He was not permitted to break it, not for a prime minister, not for a monarch, not even for the Pope. The Vice President stepping forward during that moment, it wasn't appropriate." A Marine Corps major standing nearby nodded in quiet agreement. "You don't interrupt a man's salute. Not ever. Especially not at the Cenotaph." Word of the interaction spread through both delegations in ripples. No official statement was prepared. There would be no incident report filed, no comment offered to the press pool waiting outside. But behind closed doors, the consensus among the British contingent was clear and unified. The Guard had acted correctly. There was nothing to address, no apology owed or expected. The refusal wasn't about diplomacy or politics, it was about discipline. Even within the American group, attitudes began to shift. Some aides, initially uncomfortable with what they'd perceived as a snub, found themselves re-evaluating as the hours passed. Watching the playback on a security tablet, one leaned back in his chair and muttered, "He wasn't being disrespectful, he was being exact." In the banquet hall, Vice President Vance sat stone-faced, absent-mindedly swirling the tea he hadn't touched. His fingers tapped against the fine china with restless energy as he avoided eye contact with the British officers seated across from him. He didn't bring it up again. Not directly. But his silence carried all the weight of a man who knew, somewhere deep down, that he'd misjudged a moment, and misjudged the man who held it. Meanwhile, back at the Cenotaph, Corporal Reev had returned to his post. A fresh group of tourists stood quietly along the gates, snapping photos with hushed reverence. None of them knew what had just happened. None of them needed to, because the Guard wasn't there for them. He was there for the men who never got to walk away. The convoy moved through London traffic at that particular crawling pace, reserved for important vehicles that can't afford to look rushed. Inside the Vice President's car, the mood hung heavy with unspoken tension. J.D. Vance sat stiffly beside his press secretary, one hand resting on the windowsill, the other tapping a rhythmless pattern against his knee. Nobody dared speak first. Finally, the silence broke. "That Guard," he muttered, eyes still fixed on the blurred city beyond the tinted glass, "just stood there like I didn't exist." Across from him, Lieutenant Commander Matthews, his military liaison for the trip, chose his words with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb. "Sir, respectfully, that Guard wasn't standing for you." Vance's jaw worked silently for a moment before he replied, "I wasn't trying to be disrespectful." "I know," Matthews said, his tone neutral but firm. "But those few minutes aren't about diplomacy or photo ops. They're about the ones who never made it back." Vance turned to look at him directly, brow furrowed. "It was a handshake." "It was a salute," Matthews corrected quietly, "one that was never meant to be shared." That landed harder than expected. For all his sharp edges and media-savvy instincts, Vance had served briefly as a reservist. He understood military structure in theory, even respected it. But this was different. No briefing paper could prepare him for the weight of silent tradition. He looked down at his gloved hands. "Was I out of line?" Matthews didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had softened. "I think maybe the moment wasn't yours to step into." The press secretary, who had been sitting quietly in the corner thumbing through notifications on her phone, finally offered a gentle suggestion. "We could issue a statement clarifying your intent. Frame it as honouring British protocol." Vance shook his head firmly. "No, that would make it worse." The car rolled to a stop outside the embassy, where another cluster of journalists waited behind security barriers. Camera flashes popped like mini lightning strikes against the darkened windows. Inside the vehicle, Vance straightened his tie, shot a quick glance at Matthews and asked, "You think he knew who I was?" Matthews offered a dry smile that carried decades of military understanding. "I think he knew exactly who he was, and that was enough." No further words were exchanged as the Vice President stepped out into the waiting spotlight. The headlines that evening barely mentioned the incident, most focused on diplomatic language, security partnerships, and the handshakes that did happen throughout the day. But in military forums and veteran circles, the story spread like wildfire. A Vice President's extended hand, a Guardsman's unbroken salute. and a tradition that didn't bend, not even for the second most powerful man in the free world. The ceremonial shift ended precisely at 1400 hours. Back inside Wellington Barracks, Corporal Daniel Reev removed his bearskin with both hands, setting it down with surprising gentleness on the bench beside his locker. His uniform was soaked through with sweat beneath the scarlet tunic. Standing motionless in London's peculiar humidity took more out of a man than any parade ground drill sergeant would ever admit. He sat in silence, letting the cool air of the guardroom sink into his skin. Around him, other guardsmen chatted quietly, unlacing boots with practiced efficiency, folding gloves with precise creases, checking messages on phones they hadn't touched for hours. One of the younger men, Lance Corporal Finch, looked over from across the row of lockers. "Reev? That American, he really tried for a handshake during the silence?" Reev said nothing at first, just unfastened his collar, revealing the red line where the stiff fabric had pressed against his neck all morning. "Yeah," he said finally, voice low but matter of fact. He stepped forward while my hand was raised. "Did you even look at him?" "No." Reev rubbed at the mark the chin strap had left along his jaw. "Didn't need to." Finch let out a half laugh. "You're going to be a bloody legend in the mess tonight." Reev didn't smile, didn't even look up. "It's not about that." There was a pause. Not awkward, just quiet. The kind of silence that falls between men who understand certain things don't need explaining. Then Finch asked, more seriously, "What were you thinking about? Right then, I mean." Reev glanced across the room toward the folded flags displayed above the ancient fireplace, each one stitched with battle honours of a regiment that had buried more of its own than it cared to count. "I was thinking about Harris," he said simply, "and every other name on those memorial plaques out there. I wasn't holding a salute for anyone who could shake my hand back." The room went quiet, not in awkward reverence, but in understanding. You didn't need to know Reev's full story to understand why he didn't budge. You just had to know what it meant to wear that uniform. And what it meant to stand for something that couldn't stand for itself anymore. The door creaked open as a visiting officer stepped in. "Corporal Reev," he said, voice neutral. "You're wanted upstairs. The guard commander would like a word." Reev stood immediately, buttoned his tunic back to regulation and nodded once. He didn't ask why, he already knew. "Reev," another guard called out just before he reached the door, "would you have done it differently, if you'd known who was watching?" Reev paused, hand on the doorframe. The room fell silent, every man there suddenly invested in his answer. "No," he said finally. "That's the whole point of the uniform, isn't it? It doesn't matter who's watching. Kings die, presidents change, vice presidents come and go." He looked down at his white gloves, now folded precisely in his left hand. "But this," he gestured subtly to the scarlet tunic, to the room, to everything it represented. "This has to stand for something that lasts." The door closed behind him with a quiet click that somehow carried more authority than a slam ever could. Outside, London carried on, oblivious to what had happened at the memorial and what hadn't. Tourists still took selfies with guards at Buckingham Palace. Teenagers still laughed too loudly on the tube. Office workers still complained about the weather. But inside that guardroom, the silence lingered, as it always did, as it always would. And somewhere in the digital chaos of the internet, a video began to spread, grainy smartphone footage of a vice president's rejected handshake and a guard who wouldn't bend. By morning it would reach millions, spark debates in comment sections and on news shows, provoke think pieces about tradition versus progress, respect versus accessibility. But none of that mattered to Corporal Daniel Reev as he climbed the stairs to face whatever came next. Because he knew something most people forget. Some principles are worth standing for, even when no one understands. Especially when no one understands. Would you have held that salute knowing the second most powerful man in the world was waiting for your hand? And how many of us truly understand the weight of a tradition that demands silence, even when cameras are rolling and history is watching? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. If this story gave you a deeper respect for the Royal Guards and the discipline behind the uniform, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Make sure to subscribe and press the bell icon so you don't miss tomorrow's story. And if you know someone who thinks these soldiers are just for show, share this video with them. Let them see what quiet duty really looks like. You should see more of our Royal Guard stories appearing on your screen now. Check those out next. And we'll see you tomorrow, same time, with another story that reminds us all, honor doesn't need applause. It just needs to stand.